How are we all doing today? Yay! I know there was some partying last night, so it's great to see you guys here. It's great to be here in Bangkok. And sitting here in Bangkok, Google Maps tells me that we are about 8,790 miles away from the White House in Washington, D.C. I should have asked you to guess, but it's early in the morning. And as Julie and as Michelle, who spent a lot of time in D.C., can attest, it's a long way from there to here. But every day, every morning, I think we all wake up here in Asia and we're seeing news from the White House, from D.C., reverberate throughout our region with lots of impact and ramifications, everything from trade news, obviously, to the new balance of power, as well as just recently visas, student visas, and how that's impacting our region. And it's really lovely to have all of you on our panel to really help us unpack what all of this means in terms of navigating the storm that often is U.S.-Asia relations coverage under this Trump second term. So please help me welcome to this discussant Julie Pace. She is a senior vice president and executive editor of the AP and joins us from New York, typically. We've got Michelle Lee. She's Tokyo bureau chief of the Washington Post and former national AAJ president. Great to have you here. And Patrick Barta is Asia Enterprise editor of the Wall Street Journal here in Bangkok. I'm Wan Ha. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News based in Hong Kong, and I also host a podcast called The Big Take Asia. So I don't know about all of you who are coming here into Bangkok, but I have not been able to stop eating for the last few days. The food here is just incredibly yummy. So I think it's very fitting that I start off this conversation with a very important question. If U.S.-Asia relations were a dish, what dish would it be? I'm going to start with this local guy.
Is it okay if it's not a Thai dish?
It does not have to be a Thai dish.
Well, I'll just say that my answer is the lamest imaginable answer, so you guys can throw food at me when I'm done. But I'm originally from Texas, so Tex-Mex, Mexican food. I don't know how many of you guys eat Mexican food, but there's a sauce called mole sauce,
yes,
if you've ever had it. And it's a mixture of sweet, a little chocolate sometimes maybe, and also spice. So you can have enchiladas, burrito, whatever, with mole sauce. I would say the U.S.-Asia relationship has always been very sweet to me, living here for the last 20 years, but I think we're sort of skewing more towards the spicy end of the spectrum now in the Trump second administration.
Yes, a lot of tang.
So, like I said, a very lame answer.
No, that was really good. I've been thinking of mine all flight here. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back with AJA. Okay, so I also have, I think, kind of a lame one, but I love shabu shabu, and I think about U.S.-Asia relations and covering it as like shabu shabu, because each of the ingredients is very different and has its own unique characteristic and flavor, but they're all bound by like the shared broth and whatever it's cooking in, which is sort of like the themes that we all share in our coverage, like U.S.-China relations or trade or geopolitical issues or security. But you also have to, think about the individual taste and bringing out the taste of individual ingredients, which I think of as the countries that are the diverse countries in Asia, and not overlook the uniqueness of each country as we cover them. And also the broth just gets better and better as it cooks.
Love it. Very nice. Julie?
Hi, thank you for having me. And I'm always terrible at these kinds of questions, so I'm going to top Patrick with lameness in my answer. But I keep thinking about it since you asked us this question about like a salad dressing, right? On the one hand, you look at it and it's quite blended together. The economies are quite blended together, security relationships are quite blended together, people-to-people relationships in so many ways. Then you quickly turn around and it's all separated. And it feels like it's sometimes getting pulled further and further apart. So I don't know if salad dressing or mole is the lamest answer, but that's how I viewed it.
These are all perfect. And I think in some ways it really describes the complexities of covering U.S.-Asia relations these days. So well done. Give you A, all of you. Now, President Trump's first term in the White House was 2017 through 2021. Michelle, let me start with you, because during that time, you were working on the Post's fact checker column. You covered national politics out of D.C., and then you also more recently covered Northeast Asia policy during that time as well. When you look at U.S.-Asia relations, what's different this time around under President Trump's second term? And how is that playing out in the U.S. Asia relationship and our coverage.
Yeah, okay. So I cover Japan and the Korean Peninsula and sometimes Taiwan and broader regional issues at the Post now. I've been in the job for about 4 years, splitting my time between Tokyo and Seoul. So when I first arrived in Tokyo, it was 2021. Biden had just become president. And when I arrived, these officials and diplomats I've been talking to were asking, is Trump coming back? So even though there was a sense of normalcy being restored under Biden at that time, well, the Afghanistan pullout didn't help, but there was still this sort of underlying anxiety about what's going to happen after Biden, if Biden will be reelected, if the Trump years were an aberration, or if Biden's just a brief reprieve from that America First policy. And I think that those sort of anxieties have been confirmed now with President Trump coming back, and especially in Japan, because under Biden there was a lot of the relationship between the U.S. and Japan had become even closer than ever. Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden had worked really hard to just kind of bring the two nations closer in many ways, security, diplomatically, culturally. And so especially watching Trump come in and sort of treat Zelensky very differently than what the Japanese had anticipated, sort of this retreat from the global order that the U.S. forged after World War II being dismantled in a way, has resonated really deeply among the allies, which, I covered the allies, those two allies. So I think those concerns about how long this America First policy is going to exist, whether it's going to last beyond Trump, kind of realizing that perhaps Trump too could be more chaotic than some of these officials and diplomats anticipated, that's been resonating quite a bit. And one final thing is that even despite all this anxiety, I talked to a lot of officials who also recognize this as Trump's second term, that he's term limited, and that he will leave the White House after 3.5 years, and the allies will still be left to sort of pick up the pieces after that. And what does that mean for the allies? That looms very largely now.
Yeah, and I think that larger question of, what happens after he leaves office and the, long-term impact or even damage to some of these relations, right, is obviously key in everyone's mind. Now, Patrick, this also you've been here for decades, several decades now. And you also was coordinating coverage under the first Trump term. What are you seeing that's different this time around, and how we're approaching coverage?
Yeah, well, there's three things, and with the caveat that I think you'll have a much better sense than I would, what's happening in Washington. But I can speak as an observer from here and how we approach the coverage. But there are three things that I see that are different. I think the story that I saw as an observer of Washington in the first Trump administration was one of chaos and just trying to figure out how Washington works. Like what levers do you pull to get what you want? They seem to be trying to figure things out, right? And there was a deep state that they hated that was sort of pushing back on everything they would do. I think this time of course we're seeing them make mistakes. We're seeing the courts push back, but they just seem to have more of a plan, I think, this time. We had a story this morning that said they're already turning to Plan B, to come up with other justifications for their tariffs after one court just struck down their approach. So they just seem much better prepared this time, and they're eliminating the deep state as much as they can. So I think that puts a little more force behind what they're doing, and they're very serious about serious change, not incremental change. Okay. The second thing I would say is that the relationship with China is worse, considerably worse. Now, it was bad in the first Trump administration, but it's much worse now. And that's not just Trump. I mean, that's been a bipartisan thing, and I'll come back to that, I think, in a bit and talk a bit more about it. But that hangs over everything, okay? And I think that's something that we have to think about. The third thing is that as they get a little bit more wind behind their backs and they get a little better organized, the norms that we had come to accept and count on in Asia are just kind of going out the window. So relationships are, and this is true in the first Trump administration, but even more so now, are so transactional. Okay, it's all realpolitik. What is in America's interest? Okay, issues of like shared values, shared histories. We have treaty alliances. The United States has got, I think, 4 or 5 treaty alliances in Asia. all of those expectations are out the window. So if you look at covering something like the trade war, you might assume that Japan, Thailand, Philippines, Korea, these countries that have these very strong historical relationships with the United States would be first out of the gate. They would get the best deals. They will get the tariffs knocked down. Everything will be good. That might happen. It also completely might not happen, right? So like you cannot assume anything. And I guess the last thing I'd say is sort of applies to everything that we cover. South Korea, Taiwan. Taiwan's a great example because, even though the U.S. officially has this policy of strategic ambiguity, it never commits to actually coming to Taiwan's defense in a conflict. The assumption was always that it would. I mean, Biden himself actually said multiple times that the U.S. would. With Trump, we have absolutely no idea. I think probably, maybe not, I don't know. And so that then opens up entirely new areas of coverage and things that you have to contemplate, eventualities that maybe were not even part of the dynamic before, and it means you've got to work a lot harder to source with government officials and business people, leaders in Asia, to understand how they're reacting.
Yeah, lots of different facets there. Julie, I mean, you, before taking on the executive editor role, you've covered the White House as White House correspondent and also as the bureau chief in D.C. coordinating the coverage out of the White House and national politics. You've interviewed Trump at length. What is your sense of how this time around is different and the way that we're approaching coverage?
Well, I think I would amplify a couple of things that Michelle and Patrick said. And the first is that there is much more organization and there is much more of a plan. It doesn't mean there's not a level of unpredictability. It doesn't mean that plan won't deviate at times, but there is certainly a sense that this is a president and an administration that is coming in ready to use all 4 years to exact a lot of change, both in the United States and around the world. I think one of the things that is helping them in that regard, which is different from the first term, is there is almost no opposition. And when I say opposition, I don't mean necessarily from the Democratic Party. I mean within the president's own party, within his administration, there's no counterpoint that's being made in some of these conversations. The entire Republican Party is on board. Some still privately will say they're not, but it doesn't matter because it doesn't manifest itself in any real guardrail around some of his policies. And then within the administration, he has made this choice to ensure that if you're going to work with him in the White House or in the upper echelons of the agencies, that you are there to support his policies, that you are not there to provide a check, that you are not there to provide a counter argument, you are there to help amplify the policies. And that is a key difference from the first term, where you did have people who were working within the White House to try to provide some measure of a check. I think the other thing that I would amplify, and Patrick touched on this, is every decision is being made through one prism, and that is, what does President Trump think is in the best interests of the United States and frankly within the best interest of himself and his own political standing. And so that does mean if you are an ally really in any region of the world, you have to expect that the norms and the traditions and the relationship that you have come to expect with the United States may look very different after 4 years. You do see countries trying to find ways to make this point to the president and to the White House that certain things are in his interest, that certain things are in America's interest, but it's not rooted, as you mentioned, it's not rooted in any notion of shared values or longstanding alliances.
I think that's so very true. Julie, I want to stay with you for a little bit because obviously we do have a more emboldened Trump, and he definitely has an agenda, certainly when it comes to, trying to control news, trying to control the coverage. And of course, the AP was on the wrong side, unfortunately, of the White House when the AP decided not to go along with the executive order to, call the Gulf of Mexico, as the Gulf of America. And until recently, until you won the lawsuit, you were barred from the White House. I wonder if you can talk through, that episode, what that means in terms of the challenge for coverage, but now obviously it's still,
Sure.
It's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing I would say is, we are a global, independent, nonpartisan news organization, and we've actually had quite a good, productive working relationship with the Trump administration in the first term through the campaigns. They know who we are, they know our independence, and they know our nonpartisanship. So it was a bit of a surprise when we were targeted early on for our standards guidance involving the name of the Gulf of Mexico. And I'll just, for a quick minute, explain why we took this position. Again, we're a global news organization, so we have to use language that is accessible and widely understood by the largest global audience possible. And so the president's executive order renaming the Gulf to the Gulf of America only applied within the United States and was not going to be adopted by other countries. Again, we are a global news organization, and we made that policy very clear. It's also in keeping with the ways in which we've handled other questions over names. There are bodies of water in this region of the world. There are names of countries all over the world where you have two different names that are being used, and we always use this policy of the most widely accepted name. We were barred from the presidential pool as a result of that policy, and it became pretty clear that the only way to sort of negotiate out of this would be to change our standards. And that just wasn't something that was ever going to be possible for us. We operate in about 100 countries around the world, and governments quite often have requests of us or demands of us. And if we were to change our independent editorial guidance under pressure from a government in the United States, of all places, what kind of signal would that have sent to the rest of the world? What kind of signal would that have sent to our journalists who are working in places where the ramifications of having that independence are much greater than getting kicked out of a pool, right? It's getting kicked out of a country, it's being detained, it's physical harm to themselves or their families. So this was a really important principle for us to stand on. It had nothing to do with being oppositional to this administration. This was about retaining our independence. We had hoped that we could resolve this outside of court. Nobody wants, in the first couple of months of the new administration, to be in court suing the people that you're covering. But as I said, there was no way to negotiate this. There was only one ask from the administration, and that was to do something that was not going to be possible for us. So we did sue, and we were really gratified to have won that lawsuit. I would encourage you, if you've got spare time, if you flew in, it's a really, actually quite riveting 40-page judgment from Judge McFadden, who's a Trump appointee in the DC courts. And it's a very robust defense of the First Amendment and the role of the independent press. And we were really heartened by that decision. Our photographers are back in the presidential pool. Unfortunately, the White House, in a continued bid to try to keep our text reporters out, has actually also kicked Bloomberg and Reuters out of for text reporters out of the presidential pool, so that they can't say that AP as a text wire is being treated differently than our peers. So that's a kind of summary of where we are, but I think it's an important episode because it shows the lengths to which this administration is willing to go to try to control the media, not just in terms of who's around the president, but in terms of the actual language that we are using.
Yeah. And I guess for a lot of us out here in Asia, I mean, it might not be apparent in terms of looking at coverage, but I wonder if, I mean, it's very obvious that White House friendly publications are getting better access and getting, in some ways, maybe more stories that are germane to what's happening now. And I wonder, how are you seeing that change within editorial decisions? How is that impacting editorial decisions and the kinds of stories that independent outlets are putting out?
Yeah, look, I can only speak for how we're handling things really at the AP, which is, it hasn't changed how we're covering the administration. Our job, as I said, is to be that independent, nonpartisan, and fact-based news organization, which means we're trying to reach audiences who support President Trump and who oppose President Trump and who fall somewhere in the middle. So our editorial decisions are simply governed by explaining to people what's happening, adding context, being able to hold the administration accountable like we would with anybody. At the same time, as you noted, it's pretty obvious that the Trump administration is trying to bring more organizations into the pool, into the White House briefing room, who are there to actually amplify his policies, right? To not bring that measure of accountability, to be there actually as a supportive voice. Now, all administrations do this to some extent. This is certainly a more overt and more organized attempt to do that.
Right. I want to pull us back to coverage because obviously I think a lot of us wake up every morning and it's like, what came out of the White House and how are you going to respond? The news has been changing often daily, in a lot of cases with head spinning speed. And I wonder, Michelle, I mean, you're out here covering, the bureau chief for both Seoul and Tokyo, and you're trying to manage all of the news that comes out of here. What decisions go into prioritizing the news, and how do you determine along with your editors, what are the core priorities when we're dealing with so little resources here out of Asia?
Yeah, I mean, resources keep shrinking and shrinking, and our newsroom, as well as many other newsrooms in the industry. So I think it is difficult to try to find the right targets when there are so many targets. The torrent of news, especially overnight, waking up to it, especially during the trade time, was very difficult to manage and navigate. And I think it's just taken a lot of collaborative work across teams. So usually with our bureaus, I'm sort of focused on what my bureau is doing, and vice versa with other bureau chiefs, but we've had to just communicate a lot more because there are shared themes coming out. We're doing a lot of sort of globalized big picture stories where all of us are feeding into it so that we don't cannibalize views from each other's stories. So we just have to be a lot more strategic about trying to find the best audience for that one big story to do. So during the trade, up to Liberation Day and through Liberation Day, I would say, when it seemed like every single day the trade policy was changing, we would have to have just one big global lead-all that all of us are working together on, because otherwise it just becomes too many individualized stories that don't make that big impact. And then on top of that, I think, especially as a bureau chief looking at the coverage of my turf, I have to be thoughtful about how this trade war out here still also affects US consumers in the US. So how it both affects Japan and the US consumers. And I think that's sort of a tricky balance to try to manage. But it's looking at story themes like, for example, Toyota, taking huge hits because of the auto tariffs and steel tariffs and aluminum, but also trying to tie that back to US wallets and say, how this could affect consumer prices, car prices. So just being a little bit more strategic about framing of the stories during a time when it's so hard for any one story to be elevated.
Yeah, and I think definitely collaboration is key in covering a lot of these stories. Patrick, what about you guys and how you're approaching it at the Journal? Obviously, I'm not quite sure how many people you have out in this region, but how do you allocate resources when stories change and all of a sudden, this week it's all about visas, for example?
Yeah, there's a lot of whiplash for sure. I know you guys have felt it too. We've cut a lot. I've been in Asia for 20 plus years, and the year before I came, we cut a ton of staff in Asia. Then the third year I was here, we cut staff, and then the seventh year we cut staff. It's just it's not new, right? It's just been wave after wave after wave, and it's not just us, it's everybody. But I actually don't worry too much about the resources. We're actually a very well-resourced news organization, and I think everyone, and Bloomberg is for sure, AP, we've all found ways to make choices. And I think one of the things we're trying to do now is to make smarter choices about what we cover. So basically we're trying to approach things on two tracks. You do still have to follow the news. Unfortunately, for better or worse, if Trump says something, you got to cover it because he moves markets, whatever he says that given day is going to influence decisions people make. We have to read the tea leaves. What is he saying? What's he doing? But we are increasingly, and this is really more my role, I manage a lot of our enterprise projects outside the US, Asia, and sort of ex-US. We're dedicating more and more resources to sort of trying to get away from covering the noise, because a lot of people cover the noise, right? In fact, you can just get the noise by going on to X or True Social or whatever, right? So we're making more and more choices with the limited resources that we have to pick bigger features, investigations, scoops, narratives, stories that, and I think we'll probably come back and talk about AI, but things that AI can't do, right? Things that only humans can do. And so, we will make a decision, take, for example, the students thing. We have to cover the fact that, that they announced whatever they're going to do with students and revoking visas. But we're in a position here where we can actually talk to a lot of the Chinese students that are affected and want to go to the United States. We can do investigative work looking at what are these allegations that the Trump administration is making about the way that China or other countries are influencing universities. I just read in our story today, like I can't remember the numbers they're throwing out, but the amount of money that's being given to Harvard by China, is it a problem? Is it not a problem? Separating fact from fiction, like that is the crucial thing for me, trying to figure out how we can do stories that will separate fact from fiction about what the Trump administration is doing. And we still completely have the resources to do that.
That's great to hear. And Julie, I mean, you obviously are in the position to obviously make a lot of these coverage decisions. How do you manage that? I mean, how do you figure out prioritization, especially out here in Asia when we do have less bodies?
Yeah, so one of the really conscious things that we decided going into the second Trump administration, as you mentioned, I was the bureau chief in Washington during the first Trump administration, so I have the benefit of knowing firsthand a lot of the sort of mistakes or things that I would do differently, and now having the chance to implement those. And I think one of the struggles in the first term was, and we struggled with this, and I know others did too, trying to do everything, right? I mean, there was so much happening, and it was happening at such speed, and you felt like you were just ping-ponging back and forth between so many issues and trying to be the sort of most comprehensive, at least from our perspective, the most comprehensive sort of source of information. And the result was, at least I felt like we were good at a lot of things and not great at anything. And so we made a very conscious choice to focus on a couple of key policy areas that we thought were going to be the most impactful, and then to also try to frame those policy areas around impact, to really say this is something that we can uniquely do. We are in all 50 states in the United States. As I said, we're in 100 countries around the world. We're on the ground in these places, so we can be that organization that is really going to focus on the impact. So we have focused largely, and we obviously cover many things, but we have focused largely on immigration, which is a major issue, obviously, in the United States, health policy, also in the United States, and then the global economy. And that is really the prism through which a lot of the coverage about the US-Asia relationship is covered right now. But again, we're trying to look at this just in terms of impact. What does it really mean if you have tariffs of a certain rate? Who are the people impacted by this? Who's the business who's impacted by this? What's the consumer impact on this? I would say that I think education has sort of started to creep into that priority list, just given what we've seen with the ways in which the administration has targeted Harvard and other universities, and now what we're seeing with student visas with China. But again, it's through that prism of impact that we're really trying to focus on.
And I imagine, Michelle, I mean, that must be something that you also are looking at. When we talk about U.S.-Asia relations, I mean, we really can't take China out of the picture there. And we've seen obviously lots of zigzags on trade, but also there's just lots of news on the bilateral and multilateral relationship, and even how China now is flexing, its influence here in Asia as well. And I wonder, I mean, how do you approach coverage of China on the trade issue when you don't necessarily cover, China specifically? How do you approach that, and what that means for the rest of Asia, and especially when you're looking specifically at China and South Korea, and making that resonate for an international audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually even without the U.S.-China story, there are other big competing stories that we're facing if we're not right in the middle of it. Like, since the Ukraine war, it's been pretty hard for the rest of us not directly covering Ukraine war to really try to pitch stories or be elevated in pitch meetings. And then when that sort of started to subside, then Israel Palestine happened, and so like with Gaza, it's even harder, and then now U.S.-China. So it's been a long-term kind of balance that we're trying to keep if you're not specifically in that story, because you still want to pitch stories that are resonating with those big themes, but you're not overlooking your specific perch and the important things that have to be covered in your perch. Japan, South Korea, North Korea, there are huge changes happening, huge stories happening within individual countries, but a lot of times it can be overlooked because you're trying to shoehorn your story into a US-China story, or shoehorn your way into a Ukraine story. So I try to do those sort of multilateral those stories when I need to, but try to focus on what I can originally do as the person in my role. So when I have the opportunity to pitch how U.S.-China relations are affecting, for example, trilateral relations with U.S., Japan, South Korea, I will absolutely jump on those. But I will focus a lot of my time on the enterprise stories, the investigative stories, the stories that truly I can do, that come from my reporting on the ground, and I try to spend a lot of my time doing that. And I'm lucky that our editors also support the bureau chiefs to take this strategy because they know how the audience has been split with these many big story themes that are happening, and you're competing with a very noisy news environment, not just on the global stage, but on domestic politics as well in the US. So I've tried to focus my energy on stories that especially have multimedia elements that I can make visually appealing, that can be told across many platforms. So not just on WashingtonPost.com, but I turn them into Instagram stories for both my personal account and the Washington Post account. I film TikTok videos out of it so I could reach new audiences there. I'll turn it into a newsletter and send it to people who follow my newsletter. So you just have to be a little more, you gotta hustle your way into making your story elevate, but really have to be disciplined in making sure that you're not distracted by all the other stories that there are other bureau chiefs covering, and making my coverage impactful and as unique and original as possible.
I think that's really great because I think a lot of us here in the room who are based in Asia are competing with a lot of these big stories and trying to find ways to make sure that what we have has impact and also resonates as well.
Yeah, and I would say there's absolutely audience for original, well thought out, good, deep reporting. I'm sure you know as enterprise editor, but there's absolutely audience for it. And I think especially as reporters, we tend to think, okay, how could I be a part of this big news happening elsewhere? But if you sort of flip that and think, how can I use the attention that's coming on our website and on our homepage and the apps to sort of elevate a different type of perspective that people might want, maybe as a reprieve from different news, or just sort of looking for diversity, there's absolutely audience there. So I think if you, especially as editors, if you do kind of take this approach on letting your correspondents take that exploration and find what will eventually reach the audiences, I think you will find that it is a fruitful exploration.
That's great. What about you, Patrick? Because obviously this is exactly what you're dealing with when you're talking about enterprise, right?
Well, for us, enterprise can mean a lot of things. It can range from scoops to big long narratives, but it is becoming basically the heart of what we do. I think going back to one of your points, we had looked at coverage. I mean, we're business, financial, economics paper, but we cover a lot of things. But I think we always have viewed ourselves as the paper of record, so to speak, for the business world. We can't be comprehensive anymore. We just can't, And like we've had a big debate, for example, like we would cover corporate earnings, General Motors announces their earnings, et cetera. We still cover those kinds of things, but that was sort of like meat and potatoes, kind of story if you're a business reporter, covering the company's announcements and things like that. And I think the view increasingly is, yeah, okay, you might still do some of those stories. Those stories kind of need to be enterprising. You need to sort of inject enterprise into everything you do. So even if it's like a daily story, come into it with some other reporting that elevates it some way. I think also the thinking increasingly is, if you as a journalist think that that's your job, and you can come to work in the morning and you can cover this thing that happened that day and then go home, that's not your job anymore, because that's not enough. That can be done by, I hate to say it, by a machine, to put it in the bluntest terms. What a machine cannot do is tell you how General Motors is dealing with the strategic dilemma of, they want to build an EV business and China is dominating global EVs, but the incentive structures that were set up under the Biden administration are going away and tariffs are like blowing up your business, and how are they going to do that? You can do a lot of writing about that, but that's not going to necessarily come from a daily spot story. So I think it's essentially about infusing enterprise into every single thing that we do.
That's a good thought. Since you mentioned AI and kind of the use of bots and machines, I think there's a lot of concerns about whether AI is going to take our jobs. I think a lot of us have started to explore AI. We've got, Mike, I think, did a great session on AI tools yesterday, and I think we'll continue the conversation over the next couple of days as well. But I wonder, how are your newsrooms and how are you, approaching AI and using AI? Is it for research? Is it, obviously, you can also use it to write very rudimentary stories as a first pass as well. I'm wondering, what is the approach to AI that makes sense?
We've been using AI, not generative AI, obviously, but AI at AP for about a decade, more than a decade at this point. And some of the early use cases were things actually like earnings reports, right, where we could use AI to take up corporate press release and summarize that, or sports scores. And what we were able to do, again, looking back a decade or more, what we were able to do is take the journalists who had been doing that and deploy them to other coverage areas to say, you don't have to write the GM earnings report. You can write the story about, something deeper. You can do more original source reporting. And so it's that same philosophy that we're taking to use cases around generative AI. What are the places where, frankly, again, the AI can deliver the basic fact and the journalist can do something deeper? So we have a lot of experimentation kind of happening around that. We also have a couple particular use cases that we have deployed. Nothing that is, I would say, particularly different than what you're probably hearing in a lot of newsrooms or a lot of organizations. Things like translation. We've been able to significantly increase the volume of Spanish language copy that we are moving right now, which has allowed our translators, our Spanish language translators, to actually serve more as editors, which means they can take the copy that's being translated using AI and think about what's the additional context that I need, what's the nuance that maybe has gotten lost in the translation. And to me, that's really exciting if you can think about not just translating copy, but actually making it like more of value to the audience who's consuming it in another language. Certainly personalization, summarization, I think are things. But the other side of this is not about the journalistic output. I think it's also just about like the efficiencies that it can create for us. We are all in, no matter what news organization you work in, whether you work at the AP, the Journal, the Post, Bloomberg, a small news organization somewhere in the world, we're all resource constrained, right? In our own ways, whatever that means to you, everyone is resource constrained. If you can use technology to give you time back, that is the most valuable thing. That is the most valuable thing. So we are hustling to try to use AI to just create those types of efficiencies to allow us, again, to take the staff that we have and deploy them to things that are of the highest value.
That's great. What about you, Michelle, as a reporter and bureau chief?
Well, the Post is doing some interesting experimenting with AI. For example, we just did an AI summary of comments, so you can actually get the themes that are surfacing through all the comments, so you don't have to read through hundreds of them. So that's actually kind of useful to get a pulse of what the dialogue is in a story. We also started an AI tool where you can actually ask a question and it will surface Washington Post stories that have been done about that topic and pull from our own reporting and give that to you as a reader. So I think there's definitely good like reader interfacing and interacting that can be done with AI that we're already experimenting with. I mean, as a reporter, I'm also trying to find ways to make my time most efficient and use AI. I, like many of you, I'm sure, had the very like kind of scared reaction when it came to AI, like what am I allowed to do? What should I do? I had a very firm stance against it for a long time. Then when I started to realize, actually, I already use a lot of AI in my work. I use, transcription tools that take my recording and transcribe the interview. That saves me a lot of time, and I just lean on that a lot more, while making sure that I'm taking notes, so I'm not still fully dependent on AI. But it could still give you some different ideas that. It just saves a lot of time. For example, I'm constantly looking for news sources, diverse voices that aren't covered enough in the news, especially when it comes to experts who are in underserved communities, female experts. It's so hard to find when it comes to especially like geopolitical news. It's all the same white men talking on issues that they may not always have the best expertise in. Men in general, actually, not specific race, sorry. But I think I started giving prompts to ChatGPT to say, hey, who are some good experts on XYZ topic who have done research on this who are female? Or who are some experts in this region that I can talk to? It's hit or miss still, especially on the female stuff. They still give me a lot of men. So I tell ChatGPT, actually, that's a man. And it'll say, you're right, it's a man. So there's still some testing that should be done there. But I find, if that kind of capability does get improved, I would find that really useful for my reporting and just sort of trying to find different areas that I haven't been thinking about and would take me a lot of time and Googling and searching to try to find, but could make me an efficient reporter and improve the product of my reporting at the same time.
That's great. I want to just let the audience know that we will be also taking your questions as well. So please be thinking about that, and I'll be turning to the audience shortly. Michelle, let me stay with you because you were a fact checker. I mean, you worked on the fact checker column for the Post in 2017, right? Just part of the first year that Trump was in office. And obviously, fact-checking, for the last several years has become an important part of consuming news and news gathering and debunking news. And there's obviously a lot of, as Kun Prida talked about this morning, I mean, misinformation is still a huge issue, especially here in Asia and coverage. And shortly before Trump took office this year, Meta, said that it was abandoning fact-checking on Instagram and Facebook, but as Michelle and I talked about it, you still have lots of issues floating around with YouTube and WhatsApp. So I'm wondering, when it comes to fact-checking, when it comes to just how do you make sure that the news is actually accurate, I'm wondering, how does that conversation need to evolve, and what are you seeing how it's playing out, especially out here in Asia?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I joined the fact checker column in 2014 to cover the 2016 presidential campaign. When I joined, they were like, oh, it'll be, Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush maybe. But that didn't end up being the case, and it ended up being a very important election for the fact-checking team, and they asked me to stay on for the first year of the Trump White House just to sort of finish that through during my time there. At that time, it was 14, 15, 16, 17, and I really believed that the format of fact-checking we were doing, which was a 2,000-word text piece with a Pinocchio rating at the end, was just not reaching all the people who were getting information online. And so I pitched snap checks because Snapchat was big at the time. And I just sort of started experimenting with different ways we could tell this important fact-checking narrative and facts to a different audience that's already getting information elsewhere. And I think that sort of mindset is so important, especially as these platforms are just so many steps ahead of us. There's so much misinformation out there that we as reporters are only going to reach just a tiny fraction of, even if we do important fact-checking journalism, important investigations and things like that. So I think we, as reporters and as journalists, we have to keep an open mind about how to reach different audiences with that sort of the verifying information that we're doing. We need to be branching out to YouTube. For example, South Korea has, most of the people get their news from YouTube, and in Japan, it's the largest international user of Twitter outside of the US. We have to be on these different platforms. We have to get creative. We have to meet the audience where they are, because they are already getting the information with or without us. And I think we have to force ourselves into that conversation and meet how the zeitgeist is evolving. I started a TikTok account just to try to turn my text reporting into TikTok videos, and sometimes the videos get far more views than my text stories ever will. And it's just something I do on the side. It's harder to do because I'm not a full-time TikTok creator, but I think we have to change our mindset about how our reporting reaches people, because it's just a fundamentally different landscape now, and I think we just have to get creative about that.
Julie, thoughts on misinformation and fact-checking?
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and would amplify some of what Michelle said. Look, I think there's a fundamental challenge in this, right? Which is that the misinformation is always going to travel faster than the fact check, right? And there's nothing that any of us can do, because we don't control the platforms on which the misinformation is traveling. So, talk about whack-a-mole. It's like you're constantly looking across the landscape trying to figure out, what is traveling, and where can we play a role in actually correcting the record? Where do we add value to the conversation? I think, there have been some positives. One, I think internally at AP, we've kind of gotten past this notion that I remember back when we sort of first started talking about fact checking as a brand, there were all of these debates around, well, if we fact check it, are we actually amplifying the misinformation? Are we, propelling it further? I think we've moved past that, because again, it's out there, right? Whether we do a fact check or not, it's out there. So I think we've gotten past that, which is really positive. I also think that there's been a lot of good creative conversation, to Michelle's point, around the form of the fact check. If a piece of misinformation is particularly resonant on TikTok, you should probably do the fact check on TikTok in the style of TikTok, right? You should do it on the style of X, if that's where it's happening, not trying to do it in some kind of like, voice of God, old school newspaper way, because you're not actually reaching the people who are consuming the misinformation. I think the hard reality, though, again, is that we don't, we like to think that we have a lot of authority and a lot of power in the information space. We are one input, in people's lives. And so I think it's important that we continue to be there as that input. But this is a much bigger challenge. This concept of misinformation is a much bigger challenge than I think the media, news organizations alone are going to be able to solve.
Great, thanks for that. And with that, let me open it up for questions. Yep, I see Glenn with his hand up first. I think we're going to send microphones around. So yeah, if you can continue to raise your hands, we'll make sure you get a microphone.
Good morning. Thanks, panel. Thanks, Juan, for doing this. Julie, I'd like to maybe ask you a few questions about staffing and journalists. AP lost about 8%, I think, last November. But throughout the U.S., there's been something like 10,000 or 11,000 journalists over the past 3 years that have lost their jobs. I get your point about AP had to decide on several key areas to focus on, and you're doing that well. At the same time, we've never had a flood the zone administration like we have in the US now, where literally every day something of importance either to politics, economics, or American life is being announced that is changing it. And I feel like we should be doubling or tripling the number of journalists that news organizations have to cover not only the news every day, but the impact of that news day 2, 3, 4. Help me get my head around that, how you feel about that. And at the same time, many news organizations, it's not that they're losing money, they're just not making enough money. And so they're getting rid of staff in that. At the same time, that's just the US side. Here in Asia, we've got many stories that are not being fully covered. North Korea is one that has been largely off the radar for years now. Of course, we've just seen recent coverage of 75 countries now having to start repaying their debt to China for the Belt and Road stuff, $22 billion just this year. I mean, these are massive stories that are going to impact this region. And while they are being covered, of course, all eyes are on the US too and what that impacts. So I'm just trying to get my head around staffing. I get AI. I understand how it frees up some people for some things. I'm not opposed to AI. But the reality is there needs to be boots on the ground. And in the US, at least 10 or 11,000 of those boots are not on the ground anymore.
Sure. Let me take a couple of pieces of that. First,
sorry, complex question.
No,
I
it's fine.
apologize
It's
for that.
fine. Good journalists ask multi-part questions. Yes, we had some staff reductions at the end of last year at the AP. It was not 8% of journalists, though. It was across the organization, and the focus was on trying to protect the newsroom as much as possible. But I think that is the reality of the industry that we are in. We did that because we saw what was coming, not because of something that we were dealing with in the moment. We saw what was coming. We had to make sure that we were preparing our news organization for very real financial challenges in our industry. And look, I would love to sit here and say, yes, we should add 2-3 times as many journalists. I run a newsroom. Of course I would love to do that. We're businesses, right? We are businesses. We happen at AP to be a not-for-profit, mission-driven business. Every dollar that we make at the AP goes right back into the business. We have no shareholders. We have no corporate owner. Every dollar that we make goes right back, reinvested into our news organization. But we can't get overextended financially. So again, I would love to be adding journalists in all of these places, but if the revenue isn't there to support that, then that's not just a good financial decision. So that's why you have to make choices. Now, again, we are in a very good position as an organization, and I always want to be really appreciative of the resources that we have, because I know that they are quite significant, especially compared to other news organizations. But we have to make smart choices about the ways in which we are deploying them, which does mean there are stories that go uncovered. And every day I sort of leave work thinking about, oh, I wish we could be doing this. I wish we could be doing this. I wish we could be doing this. It's just not possible, right? It's not possible for one organization to take all of that on. It's not possible for any organization to be doing that. So that's why we have to prioritize. Now, it doesn't mean the issues that I mentioned are the only things that we're covering. If you look at the breadth of our report on any given day, it's pretty profound. And that includes stories again, we're in all 50 states in the United States. We're the only news organization that has committed to being in all 50 states in the United States. It's not a great business decision, I'll tell you. There's not a lot of revenue to be made out of state and local news in the US, but it's important for us to be there. It's important for us to retain our presence in every region of the world, to be physically on the ground. We make that decision because we think there's value in it from an audience standpoint, from an information standpoint. So we are trying to do exactly the things that you are saying, but again, we have to do that within the realities of the overall operating environment that we are in. And I wish that, again, there was sort of an endless, pile of money that we and everyone else could draw on to increase our resources. But again, it's about making choices and about trying to make sure that when you're making those choices that you're delivering the journalism in a way that really, I think, amplifies issues, brings accountability, and shows the impact of what's happening in places.
And I wonder, Julie, in terms of making those choices, then in the aftermath, is it a matter of, reporters taking on additional coverage? Or is it just saying, this is not as important as it was, and we just have to make this hard call of not covering that?
Look, I believe strongly that anytime you are, and I want to be really clear, like AP is not unique in this regard, right? Anytime that you are saying, look, we're having to redeploy, we're having to change our footprint here, I believe really strongly that you can't get into a situation where you're saying we're going to do the same or more with less. It's just not practical. I think it's more about evolving as an organization. It's more about thinking about where audiences are. I mean, I think about this a lot at the AP. We are 179 years old. It's a long time that we've been around. Think about the ways in which the media environment, technology, audience consumption, think about the ways that it has changed during that 179-year history. So the notion that we may be in a period of change and transition and having to think about our footprint, having to think about the ways in which we're telling stories, it's something we've done throughout our entire history. You can't survive as a news organization for 179 years and not do that. Now, the pace of that may be happening very quickly right now, but it is something that actually is very core to our DNA. So it's about thinking about things like, we need more video journalists right now. We need to be thinking about the ways we're telling stories in text in very different ways. We need to be thinking about the places where we are. There are places where maybe we had significant resources and now we need to shift them to other places right now. So it's just that constant process of trying to think about your audience, trying to think about the ways in which you're trying to thrive as a business, trying to generate revenue. Because again, I wish that we could all sit here and just focus on the mission aspect of what we do, but this is a business and we have to make sure that what we are delivering is going to allow us to continue to grow and to thrive for the next, hopefully, 179 years. I won't be running the AP at that point, but someone hopefully will be.
I don't know, with medical science these days, you might be. All right, other questions, please. Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is King from Pulitzer Center. So I guess my question is for all of you, is to get your perspective on current, so we see that the withdrawal of US from this region, and then that gives a huge opportunity for China to come in and expand its influence. So what are some of the power dynamics between US and China that you see, after Trump took over the office? That's one. And the second thing is that, how do you deal with the news fatigue? Everyone I think most people here are really tired of getting news about Trump every day. And at the same time, we have major stories happening in Asia. The civil war in Myanmar gets so little coverage. We have Prabowo in Indonesia. And also we have the Marcos in Philippines, right? These are all important things going on in the region. Yeah, so just what's your perspective on these two trends? Thank you.
Patrick, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, on the news fatigue thing, a couple things. First off, well, I remember a conversation with a friend of mine that some of you probably know, a fellow journalist, who was looking forward to the election and dreading it because he was like, not dreading it because he hates Trump or hates Biden or Kamala Harris, but because he's like, it's gonna be all this stuff. We're gonna be running around and no one's gonna want to care anymore. It's so tiring. It's actually been really interesting. It's been incredibly invigorating and interesting, like what's been happening in the last few months. These people want to completely change the world. They want to change, rewire global trade. They want to do things to take on China. They, you can agree or disagree, but they're doing something. And if you want to be a journalist, I would submit that that's the kind of world you want to live in. Now, as far as local coverage, I think that is a serious problem. But I think, look, I mean, the Wall Street Journal 25 years ago had people covering Siam Cement, right? We had people covering Thai companies. We had people covering all kinds of stuff all over the region. And it didn't really work because people weren't paying for that news. And we've seen the rise of a lot of local news organizations that weren't there. The Asian Wall Street Journal was created because there was a news desert. There was no one covering local politics in Indonesia or Thailand or wherever. And that's back to the 1980s. It couldn't really survive because you've got the Bangkok Post, you've got papers in Indonesia, you've got papers elsewhere now. That doesn't mean they're doing great coverage, or maybe I shouldn't say that because I think they are, but I think that those organizations have to step up on some level. Now, that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility of covering things that are important, say Myanmar, which we have covered quite a lot. But I would just say that, coming back to a point you made, we can't cover every single thing, and I think we have to cover the stuff that we know is crucial to our audiences. Sorry, what was the other question you had? The U.S. look, the U.S.-China relationship is pretty dismal right now, and I think that one of the things I've reacted to at times is there's always this narrative that the United States is retreating from Asia, and I think there's probably some truth to that, but I've been here, regrettably, perhaps for my age, you've been here long enough to know, like, I remember reading the stories during the Bush administration, like, oh, the U.S. is retreating from Asia, and, all this stuff, and, everything's going to fall apart, and that didn't happen. The fact of the matter is, the U.S. relationship with Asia and Asian countries has been fraught and complicated going back to World War II, and before, right? The U.S. comes and goes. It has tricky relationships or difficult relationships with its partners, and also very good relationships, and they wax and wane. The U.S. still has massive military power in the region. It is still by far the world's biggest consumer market, okay? Now, some of the things that are changing can't be stopped, okay? When I came here, the United States was by far the biggest trading partner of almost essentially every country in Asia. It is not now. It is almost completely the case now across Asia that China is the biggest trading partner, okay? You will see BYDs on the streets of Thailand a lot more, and a lot fewer, certainly not many American cars, and a lot fewer Toyotas 10 years from now. China is a growing superpower. Its influence in the region is going to increase. So it's a complicated situation, but I think that, and Trump, I think ultimately does want to retreat, just to a great degree. And I think there is some retreat, but I think that it's too soon to say that basically the United States is sort of checked out of Asia. I think if anything, a lot of what they're trying to do is pivot to Asia and create some kind of framework that they think is sustainable, sort of parallel to our situation. We're trying to make use of limited resources. I think the United States is trying to figure out how to make the best use of its resources and maintain a presence in the region.
Yeah. Julie, that question that King had in terms of, fatigue and readership fatigue, and even reporting fatigue, it happens to all of us. But given that, I mean, Michelle made an interesting point earlier, just about, offering stories that in some ways are kind of a reprieve, that are just a different thematic than what we've all been assaulted with and having to deal with. I wonder, as an executive editor, how do you approach that, and what kind of stories that are offbeat or different, anti-intuitive, non-intuitive, that you say, I'd love that, like, that's what needs to come to the surface.
Sure, yeah. We have a couple of AP people in the room, and I'm going to have them say it with me here, because you all know what we talk about internally. So we've really prioritized over the last couple of years, really, this notion of broadening the report and adding these stories of, and this is the phrase we use, joy, wonder, and discovery. And those are stories that can come from, and should come from, every region of the world, because every region of the world has stories of joy and wonder and discovery. And, we've had a lot of conversations about pushing past that notion that those are, all stories about cute animals. Like, I love a cute animal story myself, but, that's not all that it is. And so much of it is about, again, we talk about being on the ground, right? When you're on the ground in a place, you see things, you know things, you witness things, all those things you kind of talk about with your friends, with your colleagues, you see them, and there's stories in them, right? I mean, I was talking to a colleague yesterday who was telling me about a great story that they're working on that was It started with an animal. It hasn't published yet, so I'm not going to tell you. But it started with an animal. But it's actually about a real shift in economics in a country in the region, and it's a story of discovery, right? And it's about how you present it and how you bring people in. And we see that audiences do want to engage with those stories. Our hope is they may come for that story and then stay to read a deep analysis about the U.S.-China relationship, or to look at our incredible photography from on the ground in Gaza, or really engage with a deep visual investigation that we're doing. But we also know they might need that hook to come in the front door, or they may need that sort of bomb after dealing with some really heavy coverage. I know I do. I mean, I talk about that a lot internally. I can't wake up every day and just consume really heavy news. Like, it's just, I like a variety. So if I like that, if we all like that, why would we expect our audiences would be any different?
That's a great point. Yes, in the back there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for this terrific discussion. My name is Howie Severino. I'm from GMA Network in the Philippines. In my country, one of the main President Trump storylines is the impact on aid and civil society organizations, including a lot of nonprofit media organizations, some of which have had to severely cut down or are actually anticipating closure. Another storyline is the possible reaction of China to growing isolationism, the kind of hostile rhetoric coming from the Trump administration, et cetera. And as we know, the Philippines has been at the center of this geopolitical struggle or contest between the US and Philippines. My question is, what is your reading of the American mood, the public? Is this all these changes, should we be bracing for them to be almost permanent, like long-term? I know that, of course, President Trump was elected. However, to what extent does the American public support all of these changes, executive orders that probably even a lot of the voters didn't even expect? In the Philippines, we're reading about Filipino immigrants who are U.S. citizens being imprisoned and possibly facing deportation. All of these things that we're all reading about. So is this now becoming the norm in your view, or is this just a disruption from where people are going to realize, that this could be wrong, and usher in a different era after as you mentioned, the lame duck Trump presidency?
I'm happy to take some of this. I think the biggest thing I would say is, look, there's not one perspective, obviously, in the United States. I mean, it's an incredibly large and diverse country, so you're going to get people who are quite supportive of what President Trump is doing, and some people who are quite opposed to it. And I think most people, if you look at polling, most people fall somewhere in the middle, right? They may overall take immigration, for example. They may overall support restricting immigration in the United States, but may feel like some of the policies go too far. People may support the notion of cutting federal government spending, but may oppose particular aspects of the cuts. So there's this huge kind of diversity of opinion there. I think ultimately what this comes down to for Trump is the strength of the U.S. economy. If the U.S. economy is strong in the next year or two and can withstand and grow, as we come through whatever happens with the tariff policy and beyond, that allows for a lot of things if people feel comfortable with where the economy is. If the economy is weakened by a lot of his policies, that is unlikely to give him the kind of leash to implement some of these other things that he's trying to do. So that's what I'm really focused on, is what is the positioning of the U.S. economy. But you talk about whether this is a disruption or not. I think the reality is President Trump was elected twice by the American public, and maybe the first time was, you can argue, was an attempt to disrupt the system, an attempt to say, look, we don't like career politicians of both parties. We're going to try something new. Everyone saw that first term, and the American people elected him a second time. And so I don't really view this as a disruption. I think it is a very clear sign that there is a large percentage of the American public who supports the approach that he is taking. Maybe not every aspect of it, but certainly supports the approach that he's taking. And we have to think about that from a coverage standpoint. You know, if we cover everything as sort of an affront, right, or even as a disruption, and not as, you know, a president who is carrying out what he was elected to do, you know, then I think we're missing the mood and the sentiment in the country.
Great. I think we've got a question in this row as well. Yeah? If you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, sorry, I'm behind the pole. I'm Eva. I'm the data editor for Lighthouse Reports. And I actually have kind of a question for Michelle, pushing a little bit on what Kang was saying. And there's a perception that it's not just America first with Trump, but it's also kind of America first with media. And if you want to sell like an international story to US media, it has to have like a very tangible US impact. It has to make things more expensive for Americans, or it has to like implicate American companies. Like it has to, there's still like an American first part of the coverage. And I don't know if that's, again, like a perception that audiences only want to read about something that's like very tangentially connected to themselves, especially in such a sort of tumultuous time. But like, I think a lot of that is just perception, that people wouldn't be interested in, you know, a Korean gender equality evolution story, even though there are strong correlations to the US situation. And my question for Michelle is, have you found kind of a different reception, and do you have any metrics about sort of international coverage that do more deep dives or more nuance into Asian affairs that don't have an explicit US connection if they're in these other formats? So like, can you appeal to a Gen Z audience on a fairly in-depth Asian issue, like, yeah, Korean gender equality, that maybe you couldn't sell to like a traditional international desk editor who says, no, nobody's gonna wanna read about, you know, gender equality in Korea when we have, you know, women are in the US are losing their abortion rights, even though they're very related? Do you find that like, if it's a TikTok video, if you have a data-driven analysis with graphics that you're distributing on socials, that things like that resonate with a younger audience that maybe has kind of, their attention is turned away from legacy media? They're actually kind of tired of US old school and old people politics, and there is an appetite for that kind of content. And is anybody measuring that? Like, is anybody measuring like content shifts on social media and how they're being received differently than perhaps what people expect, for whether that's true or not, what the appetite is for sort of more traditional
Let me,
audiences?
before Michelle answers that, we've only got a few minutes left, and Mike, is it okay, can I take one question from this side? Because we haven't been able to do that. So if there's somebody on this side who wants to get the microphone, that'd be great. Michelle, let me have you answer that question, please.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, you know, for example, the Washington Post, we do have a primarily US audience. So, you know, when we do pitch stories for our website stories, I think we do have to keep that in mind, that, you know, geographically, most of our readers are coming from the US. However, I believe that the Gen Z news diet and news practice is completely different from the WashingtonPost.com news audience. And my theory about Gen Z news consumers is that they are a much more internationally engaged group of people whose awareness of the world has been shaped through COVID, who recognize that COVID has actually shown that we are a very interconnected world, who has a very democratized view of the internet, because it's not just a front page that's giving you the 5 most important stories, it's the algorithm, but also your curiosity. And I have tried to lean in on that. And when you talk about Korean gender, it's absolutely a huge topic of interest among people on social media, as well as WashingtonPost.com. I did a gender series that also went on YouTube and Instagram, TikTok, and it was popular because people are interested about life elsewhere, especially the younger generation. If you look at sort of these trends that are surfacing from the way people are organically consuming news and producing news, you have makeup tutorial influencers talking about human rights violations in Myanmar. There's hashtag what's happening inside Myanmar, right? So I actually riffed off of that and did a human rights-centered video series on TikTok called What's Happening in North Korea, especially during COVID, because we had no idea what's going on, and we still don't. And I think it's really I think you have to ride that momentum among this new generation of news consumers and realize that the way we've been doing pitching stories to Washington is just not going to be the way it's going to be for much longer. Unfortunately, it still is because we have a news business that caters to a certain audience on the homepage and website, but it's a much more diverse news ecosystem than what it used to be even 5-10 years ago.
It's really great. I think we've got somebody on this side. Yes,
Hi.
Juliana?
Last question. Hi, guys. I'm Juliana Liu. I'm the senior business editor at CNN based in Hong Kong. I'm soon going to be transitioning to a columnist role at Bloomberg. My question is for anyone on the panel, really. In terms of the future of US-China relations, do you think that despite the close relationship on many fronts, including business, that there will be inevitably some kind of split?
Sorry, the last, there'll be some kind of what, sorry? Split. Well, just, I mean, I think we should probably hear from all of us, but briefly, I mean, look, I've been here, like I said, 20 years, and I've seen this relationship just get worse and worse. I mean, the direction of travel is not good. It's a bipartisan thing, right? I mean, I think we may wind up in the Trump administration coming very close to where the Biden administration was in terms of export controls and tariffs and things like that. Barring some kind of big change in China, an economic crisis or change in leadership, given the fact that the United States seems to have a consensus on its approach to China, I think what you're going to see is further friction. And I think that, you know, I was here through the era of the rise of globalization and everyone getting closer, and, you know, we were all going to China and spending a lot of time there. The Wall Street Journal is basically kicked out of China for the most part, right? I don't see us getting back in anytime soon. So I think, if anything, things will probably, unfortunately, get more tense.
I'm actually going to ask Michelle and Julie to take that as well, since it's our last question.
Sorry, I missed the second part of that question.
Was whether or not, I guess, going forward, whether what we're seeing is an actual split between the U.S. and China, and I guess the decoupling of economies and relationships.
And you know, I think this current moment is definitely going to have long-term ramifications for sure on the relationship. And as Patrick said, you know, it's getting worse and worse. And especially, you know, the turf that I cover, you're already seeing Japan, South Korea look for different partners through the region and elsewhere to try to fortify different relationships, either with the EU, NATO, or Southeast Asia. And that's pretty much in preparation of this relationship continuing to worsen over time. And I think, I mean, I would definitely anticipate that the storyline will continue for sure.
Yeah, and I think full panel consensus here that we are probably going to see the relationship certainly get worse before it gets better. And I think that is in part, as Patrick alluded to, that this has become more of a bipartisan policy in the United States. Certainly, I think there are actions that President Trump is probably willing to take that maybe others have not been, particularly with the rate of the tariffs. But this notion of kind of taking a tough line on China is something that both parties really support.
And really something that we're going to see continue and have ramifications well beyond Trump. Great. Well, thank you so much, Julie, Michelle, and Patrick. It's been a fantastic conversation. Lots of nuggets for us to think about. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for being such a great audience.